Welcome back, everyone. This is Video02b, the second of two videos of this week. What I want to do in this video is very concretely talk about what I call the 9 spatial systems. Actually, it's what Beckering and Liu talk about as the 9 spatial systems in the article that we're having you read for this week. And so what I want to do is unpack that a little bit to talk about how they organize it and to shed a little bit of light on what they are trying to say. The real question here is, how did Detroit get to look the way it is? How did it develop over space as it was developing through time? And so in that sense, I want to move from the question of what defines the physical space to the actual origins of that space. When you drive through it or fly over it, what explains the patterns that you see? As I mentioned, what I'm going to be talking about derives initially from the article that we're having you read this week. And so I love in this article, I love graphs and I love diagrams, but especially I love this set of concepts around the 9 spatial systems that have shaped Detroit. And I'm a little bit obsessive about this, so I wasn't happy with just the scan that I did. And so I've actually sort of recreated their particular things, and I've actually redone them so that they're a little bit easier to see, a little bit clearer. And I want to go through those systems just one by one and talk about how they emerged and how they related to one another, so how they built on one another over time. And Beckering and Liu talk about this, but I think it's really important to have a little bit of a narrative thread that ties it together. So let me start by looking at the rivers of the city of Detroit. Probably most of you know the Detroit River that runs through the center, but you may not know that there are some other moderately significant rivers, some fairly small ones like Fox Creek and Connors Creek, a significantly larger one called the Rouge River, and a variety of others. We actually don't know much about these because most of them actually aren't free-running rivers anymore. These are the river basins that were there, but these rivers have mostly been channeled, dammed up. The River Rouge is actually hard to approach, although there's been some attempt to rewild it and to restore it to its original condition. But rivers do not play a big part of the terrain within Detroit, but they do form its core boundary as the water rushes from Lake St. Clair through the Detroit River down to Lake Erie. But for me, rivers aren't quite enough. And so actually, I want to take Beckering and Liu, and I want to take a step back from them a little bit. And I want to talk about more broadly the question of water and land in the bigger picture. Now, if you're looking for the really big picture, I can't recommend anything better than a wonderful YouTube presentation called The History of the Entire World, I guess. And if you've seen it already, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you can go and take a look at it. What I would like to do, actually, is to do a little bit of the same that this video does, because I want to think about where Detroit is in the really, really big picture over time and space. So I want to look at the entire planet, and I want to look at our location in it from 750 million years ago to the present. 750 million years ago is about as far back as we can go using plate tectonic records. And 750 years ago, Detroit was actually in the southern hemisphere. And over time, as time elapsed, it actually went further south. So 600 million years ago, it was at the bottom of the planet. It was where Antarctica is now. And then over the next 600 million years, gradually sort of moved north with some fits and starts moving north. Really, by about 200 million years ago, it was securely in the northern hemisphere, and it moved around a little bit, sometimes quite far north, sometimes a little bit further south, but it really stuck in this space in the last 200 million years ago until settling down to right about where it is now at the 42nd parallel of latitude. So this is our location. It's moved around a lot, but we're here. And if you're interested where things are going in the future, we're headed to the southwest by about 1 centimeter a year. Eventually, we'll be headed back toward the southeast. And back when we get to Pangea Ultima, the next global supercontinent in about 250 million years, we'll be just near the equator. So if you're looking to avoid Detroit's cold winters, that would be a good time for you, but it might be kind of a wait. So this is where we are. As I said, we're on the North American tectonic plate, and we're actually right in the middle of it. And the North American tectonic plate is actually one of the most stable tectonic plates on the planet. The part that we're in is actually called the North American Craton. And within the North American Craton, we are part of the Michigan Basin. Now, cratons are those parts of tectonic plates that last for a really long time. So we are really in one of the most geologically stable places on the planet. Even though we've been moving around, this land has been here for a long time. And Michigan is in a basin in that land. So it's a depression. It's a place where the actual substrate is a little bit lower than in other places. For various periods, there were shallow seas in where we are now. But what's happened over time is that water, sediment, and other things tend to drain into this basin. And it develops a kind of concentric set of circles of landforms. Let me show you what I mean by that. This is what Michigan looks like in terms of the recency of its landform. So the newest part of Michigan is actually in the central part of the state, a little bit north of Lansing. And as you move further out, those are all older and older parts, older and older geological landforms of the state of Michigan. If we were to tilt it and then look at what's underneath, what we would see is that that Michigan basin, that depression, tends to draw in sediments, which then compress the sediments below, so that it keeps compacting lower and lower and lower. So the original sediments sink furthest, and then the sediments above that sink further down. And so this is kind of one of those, looks like a set of those nested cups that you can get for your kitchen. So it means that Michigan is really composed largely of sedimentary rock, which makes it really vulnerable to erosion, the kind that produces those nested spaces. It's also the kind that doesn't necessarily stop things like geological erosion and glacial erosion. So if we move forward in Michigan's history, we see that 12,000 BCE, 14,000 years ago, where we are now was covered in miles of ice. And over time, that ice melted. It withdrew, it pulled back. So if we look at it 14,000 years ago, we see almost the entire state is covered in ice. Over time, as we moved out of the Ice Age, it pulled backward, it melted, it produced enormous runoff. Some of that went into what is now the Mississippi River Basin, some of it went to the east. And as it pulled back, it went in various different ways. And so you can see actually 9,000 years ago, the ice had pulled back, almost completely uncovering the state of Michigan. But because of that runoff, large parts of the state were underwater. And then if we fast forward beyond that, we see that 7,000 years ago, about 5,000 BCE, actually that ice had pushed its way out so that it was running all toward the east, toward the Atlantic Ocean, and it actually turned the area around Michigan, the Great Lakes Basin that we know now, Michigan and Huron and Erie, were all inland lakes with no actual connection to the sea as that water went elsewhere. And as those shrank, Michigan had gone from being largely underwater to being landlocked without an outlet to the sea. And then as things stabilized, we got a restoration of the current system. Even 4,000 years ago, quite a bit of water was running to the Atlantic through the Ottawa River, but some of it was running through the St. Lawrence River. And as the glaciers retreated completely and the Ottawa River dammed up, we get what we have now, which is the St. Lawrence River Basin. So that all of the water that falls in the state of Michigan, with the exception of a tiny corner that runs to the Mississippi in the UP, all of the water that falls on the state of Michigan runs into either Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, or Lake Erie. In Detroit, it all runs into Lake Erie. In the northern and western parts of the state, it runs into Lake Michigan and Huron, but it still comes past Detroit as it runs through the Detroit River and out. And I think it's really good to know a little bit where the water comes from and where it goes. And you can see this is what that watershed, that basin looks like. This is where all the water that lands in these places goes. It ends up going out over Niagara Falls and out through the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic Ocean. Those land and water forms, in turn, had their impact on the vegetation that grew here and the natural world that we encounter when we look at Michigan. And this shows what those initial conditions were like before human settlement in this area. As you would expect from a place that is relatively flat, that had often been underwater with really sandy soils. You have bogs, you have wet prairies and swamps. You also have forests, but they tend to be forests with relatively softer woods like beech or sugar maple. And it's those forests of beech and sugar maple that many of the initial settlers encountered when they came to the city of Detroit, because they ran right along that watercourse that is the Detroit River. When people came, they in turn shaped the environment around them. And that's really what I want to talk about for the rest of this video, how people then in turn shaped what they found when they got here. And here we can start to introduce a time frame that looks a little bit more human scale. Instead of millions of years, we're talking thousands of years. And there is actually evidence for human movement in this area as long ago as 9,000 years. And about 2,000 years ago, we start to have a regular fossil record and archaeological record of humans in this area. Native American groups came through this area, lived in this area, but of course, Native American groups tended to have a relatively light ecological impact on the area. When Western settlers came, that pattern started to change. And so in 1701, we have the foundation of the city of Detroit. We'll talk about that in the next classes. And so suddenly we get the emergence of Fort Detroit. But actually, it's not nearly that big. Actually, it's really quite small. If we actually look at this, Fort Detroit, even later on by the 1800s, the space that was occupied by the settlement of the city of Detroit was just about the size of parking structure number 2 that some of you will have the joy of experiencing in coming weeks, and some of you live right near it. That's about how big the initial Fort Detroit really was. It was a really tiny space with a very, very low population for nearly 100 years as the fort and then the village and then the town and then the city started to emerge. And so the initial impact wasn't significant, but it does create a center point. So this is the place where settlers first come. And so this is the thing, the place out from which settlement radiates. So we need to know the starting point, even if the starting point itself was not large or significant. From that particular settlement, because it was so small, we actually need to zoom in a little bit so that we can look a little bit more closely at the actual impacts that settlers had and the spatial systems that formed after the creation of Fort Detroit. The next formation really involved increasing settlement up and down the river. So Detroit was for a very long time a very linear city with almost everyone living on the water. Water was the only way to get access to the broader world. It was the only way to move crops around. And so Detroit saw the emergence of what are known as ribbon farms because they are long, thin stretches of farm, usually with the farmhouse on the water, and then the farm stretching in a long and linear fashion quite some ways back away from the water. And so these ribbon farms, as we're going to see, actually shaped what came after because those properties were sold in particular chunks and in particular ways, and the boundaries between the ribbon farms ultimately became the roads that you find when you travel in downtown Detroit and when you travel up and down river. So those really formed the backbone of the city. Even as the city's population was small, it tended to take up a lot of space through that formation of those ribbon farms. As the city got bigger, as the population started to expand, and as the city needed money to build up its own infrastructure in the early 1800s, the federal government ceded land to the city of Detroit, the sale of which was supposed to help the city build a new courthouse and a new jail. And so the city sold what was called the 10,000 acre tract. Actually, it wasn't actually 10,000 acres, but they sold land that was to the north and west of the fort that was parallel to those angled ribbon farms that ran at about a 30-degree angle from the southeast to the northwest. And so new tracts of land were sold away from the river in squarish parcels because they couldn't be connected to the river. And so this then formed a further development in the city of Detroit as people bought land in those spaces and settled in those and built small farmsteads and even housing and some small sort of village-like spaces. And then in addition to that, at around the same time, the US federal government was actually engaging in a broad act of surveying the entire country and imposed a grid, originally devised by Jefferson, of 6-mile squares with mile roads at each space. And so you get this 6x6 set of squares, and those were based around Detroit, starting at a center line point just north of the city. But of course, this intersected with, not at the same angle as the 10,000 acre tract. And so it started to create a series of different kind of spatial arrangements. And you can see how if roads are following those parcels, how the roads are going to start to get complicated, and Detroit's going to have a lot of different spatial frameworks that are shaping the kinds of traffic and shaping where people live and what they do and how they go about it. And then in addition to that, shaping Detroit are the so-called radial avenues. And you actually can do those radial avenues with your hand. At the Detroit Historical Museum on the outside in the flag court, you can actually see those in a giant display. But those streets with Woodward running from southeast to northwest, and then the other streets, the other major radial avenues to the east and west, those really shape the major traffic patterns. And these were built on military roads, which in turn, legend has it, were built on initial kind of Native American pathways from one place to another. And so these particular pathways also intersect with the roads from the ribbon farms, the roads from the 10,000 acre tract, and the roads that are built around the Jeffersonian grid to shape where all of the roads are in the city of Detroit. And then within those spaces, we see the infill of a street grid. Those are really big roads and spaces, so smaller streets and roads get built in those spaces, and those roads end up forming the basic streets of Detroit. You can see how that street grid emerges, gets more dense over time from the late 1880s to 1900 to the early 1920s. That street grid gets radically filled in with more and more streets in more and more spaces in the city. Finally, you have two other systems that emerge in the latter part of the 1800s and the middle of the 1900s. And the first of these is yet another traffic pattern. It's the emergence of railroads. And largely railroads often fill space wherever railroad companies can find land, wherever they can find space. So they tend to curve around. They tend not to follow those regular grid patterns because the railroad companies are dependent on where they can get the land from. But you see the emergence of railroads, which are incredibly powerful in shaping particularly where economic activity happens, because those places need to have access to the raw materials that can be shipped by railroads. And then in addition to those, in the 1900s, you get the emergence of highways. You can see in the picture above the Davison Highway, which is actually the first submerged expressway in the entire United States, but a whole variety of freeways emerge between the Davison being built in the 1940s through even the late 1980s. All of these spatial systems together form the shape of the city of Detroit, but each one forms the previous one. And one remarkable example that I discovered while I was doing this is that if you actually look at where I-94 runs, as it runs from southwest to northeast, it is absolutely remarkable that I-94 runs at almost exactly the northern limit of almost all of those ribbon farms between those and the 10,000-acre tract, because that was the space that was left without such clear ownership. It tended to be a throughway between those spaces. And so the highways that we drive on are shaped by ribbon farms built over 200 years ago. And the ribbon farms are shaped by the vegetation that the settlers found, those beech and maple forests, which weren't too swampy and boggy, and yet were easy enough to clear, and that's how they went that far inland. So geography shapes biology, which shapes human settlement, which shapes the roads and transportation systems that we use to this day. Now, I promised 9 spatial systems, but there are actually 3 additional spatial systems that I want to talk to you about that Beckering and Liu talk about, but they don't actually build into their graph, but I think they're really important to look at. The first of those is the car factories. And we're going to talk a lot about the role of automobile production in the city of Detroit, but I think it's safe to say that all of you have an awareness that cars were really important for the city of Detroit, and car factories were incredibly important for the people of this city. They were the dominant form of employment by far, as dominant as any industry is in any city ever. And so where those were located actually shaped where neighborhoods were built and how those neighborhoods functioned. And those were located, in turn, where the railroads and roads tended to converge. And so if you take Woodward into school, or if you're even just driving up and down Woodward, you'll see, for example, the Henry Ford Highland Car Factory, at least what's left of it. But there are automobile factories all across the city of Detroit. Some of them have been torn down, but actually many of them are still there. And they really shape the morphology, the shape of the city of Detroit. The second pattern that Beckering and Liu talk about, but don't actually put on their framework, is what they call redevelopment policies, because a large part of the city in the 1950s and 60s was subject to being bulldozed, partly in order to build those immense highways, and partly around those highways to what was euphemistically called slum clearance, getting rid of parts of town that the city didn't necessarily want to deal with, and forcing those inhabitants to move elsewhere on the argument that it would be better for people to not live in poor areas. Of course, where are poor people going to go? But that's something that we'll be talking about over the next couple months. So huge swaths of the city were cleared of existing structures and habitation in that redevelopment policy. And you can still see the legacy of that if you look to the east of I-75, something that I hope we'll have a chance to do, or around the lodge and right along the riverfront, you will see the impact of those redevelopment policies, and in other places around the city that I haven't specified here. And then finally, a spatial system that they don't build into the model because it actually doesn't fit in the graphs that they're doing, but they talk about in a different set of graphs, is the urban sprawl that faced the city of Detroit over the last century. So instead of fitting into their 9 spatial systems, they actually devote a unique graph to it, and they show the space of the city in terms of population density. So when population reaches a certain density, it qualifies to go on the map. And they show it emerging sort of amoeba-like with that dark center that was there by 1921, and then getting bigger with the darker grays by 1935, and then the slightly lighter grays by 1968, 1987, and finally the furthest extent when they wrote their article of 2009. I actually like this map, but I wasn't satisfied with it, so I went and color-coded it so that you could see. So the oldest is the red and moves out through orange, yellow, green to blue. And so this is how the city grew over time. But to really understand the size of it, we've actually got to go back and look at our initial map, because almost everything that I was talking about actually was built-up area already by 1921. That's the red areas that you see there, with a little bit of orange around some of those other streets. But this is only a fraction of the size of what is now Metro Detroit, because if we look at it in the broader sense, that initial space, that small space, is just a tiny fraction of what the city is today. So as the city began to sprawl outward, we saw more and more land being converted from forest to agricultural purposes, and from agricultural purposes to settlement purposes. To give you a sense of the scope and scale of this sprawl, something we're going to be talking about later, you can actually take a look at the size of the city in 1921, that's the red, and the amount of land that the metro area added to its city between 1987 and 2009. So a 22-year period, the amount that was added into the urbanized area is larger than the total land area of the city in 1921. So it took 220 years to get to that space, and then in 22 years, from 1987 to 2009, the city actually added more than that amount of urbanized land space. It's just absolutely remarkable, and it's something that we're going to be talking about in class. So that's the big picture. All of these are open questions. We're going to come back to almost everything that we talked about here, but I wanted to give you a brief initial introduction to the space of the city and to think about these two core questions. So what I like to do at this particular point is to come back to those questions and to ask, what defines the physical space of Detroit? And here, actually, I would encourage you, while you're watching this, hit pause on your video and see if you can answer that question. So hit pause. All right, you're back from your pause. So what do you think defines that physical space of Detroit? Well, it really depends. I mean, it depends on if we're going to define it narrowly, legally, as just the city, that space that you see in red there, or are we going to define it more broadly as the metropolitan area? Now, the city of Detroit is the largest municipality in the metropolitan area, but it's only one of over 100 in the metropolitan area in that tri-county area. So it depends on whether we're talking just the municipality, just the city, or whether we're talking the metro area, or really, if we're talking some of those larger conurbations, really all of Southeast Michigan. The second question that you might want to ask yourself is, how did the city get to be this way? So I'm going to ask you again to pause. See if you can answer the question. See if you can think through the steps by which the city changed and what those spatial systems were. So hit pause. All right. If you're back from hitting pause, I would say that the real key is the elements that we're looking at here. That natural landscape that emerged over time with tectonic change and ice ages and other geological change that shaped the natural landscape, the vegetation that was here, which shaped the early land use, where that initial fort was and where those ribbon farms emerged from, which shaped the way that the land was sold and the way the land was shaped into grids, and then was modified by new technological innovations, better roads, railroads, highways, and then was subject to really intensive land use with factories and with later redevelopment attempts to shift populations around. And then finally, that pressed outward with population pressure, but also economic pressure and really kind of perverse economic incentives to get bigger and bigger over time. I think that's the kind of spatial story of the city of Detroit. We're going to come back to it, so just know that you'll be seeing these things again, and they'll make more sense as we start to layer in the various other pieces of migration and industry and employment and so on. So that's really it. That's what I wanted to talk to you about in this video. We are now in week 2, but we're going to be moving into week 3. So in week 3, we're going to be meeting in person in General Lectures 150, some of you at 10:30 a.m., some of you at 2:30 p.m. We're going to be talking about the history of Detroit, the when of the city, really from the first human settlements through about 1900. And I'm going to ask you to read the Farley and Danziger reading in Canvas, which is a fairly statistical but still pretty interesting discussion of how the city emerged, building on some of the things we've talked about, but talking not so much about the physical geography as the human geography, who the people who came were, what they did here. That's it. Thank you, everyone. I am so grateful to be able to have you in class. I really look forward to meeting you in the coming Monday class, and I wish you